Welcome to the Hobby School podcast. Whether you're a seasoned hobbyist or just getting started, Hobby School is the perfect place to learn something new. My name is Dr. Destiny Kopp, and I'm your host of the podcast. But before we jump into our episode for today, the only thing I ask is that if you enjoyed the episode, please share with a friend and give us an honest review on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us get out the content to more people. I also want to invite you to get on our wait list for our next Hobby School Online Learning Summit. These are free to attend, and you can find the link to join at hobbyschool.com, which is also in our podcast show notes. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. And today, my special guest is Courtney Johnson. She is the owner of the Kitchen Garten. She's a wife, a homeschooling mom of three, a lifelong gardener, as well as a certified master gardener and a garden coach. She enjoys teaching others about how to get started in gardening right away in their own backyards, as well as how to take garden fresh produce and use it in delicious recipes or preserve it for later use. She is the owner and content creator behind the Kitchen Garten website and has published several gardening books and planners, which can be purchased on her website. And Courtney, thank you so much for joining me. I am super excited to chat with you today about how to plan a fall garden.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. This is obviously a subject that I'm very passionate about, and I'm happy to share the knowledge that I have with others.
So I have a lot of great questions for you. I don't know a lot about this topic myself, so I definitely want to dive into it. But before I do that, can you tell the good audience a little bit more about you and how you got started into all of this and how you help people?
Sure. Well, I come from a long line of gardeners and farmers. My grandparents, both sides, always had a garden, and my father's side of the family were actually farmers. He grew up in a farming household. And so I feel like the gene just kind of carried on. But as soon as my husband and I got married, and we had our own house, the first thing I wanted was a garden. And so since that point, I have learned through a lot of trial and error what to do, what not to do. I'm actually still learning. I think most gardeners would tell you that it is a lifelong process of learning new things, but there is something really magical about being able to put a seed into the ground and seeing it grow, and also being able to see how food grows, especially now that we have children. We have three children, where their food comes from, how you can grow things at home, and just the importance of some sustainability of being able to actually produce food in your very own yard. I think it's a really important skill that I certainly want to pass on to my children and to anyone who has a little square inch of land that they want to use. I think anybody really can learn to garden, no matter if you think you have a black thumb or not. I think that there's something for everybody to garden with.
So Courtney, I will tell you that my experience with this has been very limited. So during COVID, when everybody was starting home gardens, we thought, that would be great. We have the time. We'll, buy one of those little raised beds, or I guess it was still in the ground, but I think it was still considered a raised bed. And I will tell you, it didn't go very well for us. So I'm anxious to kind of delve into this with you. And I will say that when I think of starting a garden, and again, this is based on my very limited experience with this, I always think about you got to plant in the spring. But we're going to talk about today about how to start and plan a fall garden. And is it really possible to do this in the fall? I don't even know what grows in the fall.
Right. And that is a really common misconception, actually, among people who think that you really can only garden in the spring and the summertime, that's when you get your tomatoes. Isn't that when we're supposed to garden at home? But honestly, the fall is, I consider to be one of my favorite times of year to garden. And there's a few reasons for this. One, it's a whole lot cooler outside, so I'm not sweating, sweating all the time. And you can garden throughout the day. Here in the summertime, if I don't get it done in the morning or in the late afternoon, there's nothing happening in the garden because it's just so hot. So the fall really gives you the flexibility to be out in the garden all times of day. Um, the other thing is that there tend to be fewer pests in the fall. So, whereas we're fighting all kinds of things in the summertime, the fall doesn't have as many because it gets cooler at night. That's not very sustainable. Temperature wise, for some pests, it naturally kind of kills them off. So that's really nice. There's less watering because you don't have that sun beating down on your plants and your soil every day. So there's less water, so less resources you're having to pay for. And then finally, I do find that you can grow some super nutritious things in the fall that just can't hack the heat of summer. I'm thinking like your leafy greens that are just so rich in iron and vitamin C and things like that. Perfect to grow in the fall. And it really is an encouraging time of year for beginner gardeners because things like kale and lettuces and spinach are so much harder to kill. So you can really uh, you can tend your garden less in the fall and still see some pretty great results. So I think for beginner gardeners, it's a really great time to begin.
So that's what I probably should have done. I probably should have started in the fall. And you did mention some of the things that do well in the fall, like the kale, the spinach, some of the more, leafier type greens. What else? If I was planning out a fall garden, what other type of vegetables could I expect to get during that time of year?
Great question. Great question. You have your classics, and a lot of these are going to be greens because that's just what does really well. But you do have your classic greens of your kale, collards, turnip greens. So if you live in the South, at least the collards, the turnip greens, the mustard greens probably all sound very familiar. They are classic Southern foods. And but you can also grow things like lettuces, like romaine, or your mixed lettuces, or mizuna, which is a very like a spicy, delicious green. Some more Asian choices like your tatsoi and your bok choy also grow really well in the fall. Swiss chard, which is gorgeous. If you've never seen it growing, or if you ever try to grow it, you can literally grow Swiss chard in your front flower bed, and people will stop and ask what it is. It's got these brightly colored stalks with these beautiful green leaves, and you can eat them raw or you can saute them. So yummy. And you can eat the stem almost like a piece of celery. So lovely, lovely. Um, I also tend to grow my garlic in the fall. So garlic is one of those, I hesitate to even call it a vegetable. It's in the allium family, but it is planted in the fall and then left alone and harvested in May or June. So I also tend to plant my garlic in the front flower bed because it's just some green tops that come up, and you just make sure that they stay decently watered. Some years we are successful at that, and some years not. And I call it my set it and forget it plant, because you can just plant them and just let them grow. So those really are my favorites. You can also grow some things like carrots. If you go ahead and start them at the end of the summer, they'll grow into the fall. Same thing with your brassicas like cauliflower and broccoli, cabbage, all of those things like the cooler temperatures. And hopefully planting in the fall. You can also plant those things early spring, but planting in the fall, again, will give you a little bit of an advantage on bugs because there are certain types of bugs that just love to eat those cabbage and that broccoli and cauliflower and things like that. So you can have a very great variety of vegetables growing in the fall garden. Don't feel like it has to just be your leafy greens.
Well, and a lot of things that you mentioned there, I absolutely love them, like the carrots
Yes.
and the cauliflower and the broccoli. So there's tons of options that you gave. But I really liked your tip on what some of this you could actually plant in a front flower bed, which
Yes.
is, because a lot of us, myself included, we don't have a ton of space. I certainly don't live on a farm, which has acres and acres there.
Right.
But a front flower bed would be absolutely perfect. So, Courtney, I really loved the tip that you had about some of these fall like vegetables we can actually plant in our front garden. And the one I think that you mentioned there, it was like the Swiss charge, I thought that was just a really, really good tip because a lot of us, including myself, we just don't have a lot of room to plant a huge garden. I certainly don't live on a farm that has acres and acres there. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of space is required for a fall garden, and can we do it just on a little like raised bed, or what do you recommend there?
Right. This is such a great question and something I get asked a lot. And I honestly have to say that my inspiration for utilizing all of the space within my yard comes from Amy Strauss's book called The Suburban Micro Farm. And she has her own website called The 10th Acre Farm. And she literally grew enough vegetables to produce a CSA, community supported agriculture, I think is what it stands for. Essentially, she could sell the produce from her yard and all she had was a tenth of an acre. And so I got a lot of ideas from her, like planting the Swiss chard in the front flower bed, as well as growing the garlic in the front flower beds, herbs, lots of lettuces you can grow in the space where you probably have shrubs now. You can also utilize, of course, raised beds. I think a lot of us think about raised beds when we think about a garden, but you can also use planters on your patio or your front porch or a balcony, even if that's all you have. In fact, one of the most popular classes I ever hosted locally was making self-watering planters out of galvanized buckets. And I had women telling me for months that those plants just kept growing and kept growing because things like lettuces that are very popular in the fall, you can cut and come again. That essentially means if you've grown something like romaine, you can cut off the outer leaves to take inside to eat for dinner, and then the plant itself keeps growing and producing. So you can cut again and then come back and cut again and come back. So you don't have to have a lot of space. If you are going to grow something like broccoli and cauliflower, obviously that's going to require a little bit more. For that, a raised bed is really lovely, or something like an earth box, which you can get those on Amazon and they are great. They're going to require a little bit more space and care, but still completely doable. So yeah, those are some things that I think don't have as much space constraints uh, as some of your bigger summer vegetables like tomatoes and things like that.
So I like what you said about having that self-watering planter. That sounds exactly like something that I would need to start on something like this. So can you tell the good audience here if they're, if somebody out there is thinking about planting a fall garden, where would you recommend that they start?
Great question. Well, always tell people to start by thinking about what you eat. I think sometimes when we get into a planning phase of a garden, especially if you have a seed catalog or you're at your local hardware store that has plants, our dreams tend to go tend to go beyond what we can realistically support. So I like to tell people just to sit down and what are some things that you eat pretty frequently that your family enjoys. This is from personal experience of growing lots of eggplant, only to find out that I'm the only person in this house that actually likes it. So think about what your family likes to eat and then plan accordingly. If you're a beginner gardener, I can't stress enough Mel Bartholomew's book, Square Foot Gardening. It really breaks it down into, if you're using a raised bed, for example, if your raised bed is broken up into square feet, so that means a 4x4 bed would be 16 square feet, how many plants can each of those square feet support? So things like one broccoli plant or 16 carrots. He's very specific, but for a beginner gardener, it's perfect. Okay, sometimes we need to have our hand held, and just be told, like, say, what do I need to plant here? What exactly does this plant need? And so there are so many great resources for that. And I have a lot of how to grow guides on my website for how to grow pretty much everything. And there's some really wonderful resources out there, both online and at your local library, that you could probably check out.
So the last question I have for you, Courtney, is the fall garden that we start now. Can we, bring it through to the winter? Can we add to it, or will some of the things still be growing in the winter? How does that work?
Sure. Uh, Great question. And a lot of that depends on where you live. So you and I, of course, both live in the southeastern part of the United States, and we can pretty much grow all winter long. So that kale and those collards that we plant here in the fall, spinach also, parsley will carry all the way through and will probably still be there come the spring garden, Swiss chard as well. Some things will naturally die out. If you plant carrots and radishes, obviously when you harvest those, they'll be done. But if you live in more northern climates, then the chances are that your plants, once you get into the really hard parts of winter, may freeze over, and that's okay. It's okay to give your garden a rest. But if you would like to continue gardening and you do live further north, then there are certainly things that you can do, such as putting a cold frame over a raised bed, which kind of looks like a little mini greenhouse, and it just sits on top, and it will keep your plants protected in that harsh weather. So it certainly is possible for you to grow all winter long. It's just very dependent on where you live.
So, Courtney, thank you for all of your great tips today. And before we leave, can you tell folks where they can find you and learn more?
Sure. Thank you again for having me. And your listeners can find me at the Kitchen Garten, and that's garden with a T, not garden. It's the German word for garden. And I have lots of resources there, all free for you guys to check out, because it really is my goal for people to be able to grow food in their own backyards and to do it in a fun and easy environment.
And I'll make sure that the links for that, for your website and for your Instagram and YouTube, are on the podcast show notes, so everybody can just click on it and find you. And you also have a free
Perfect.
gift for the audience too.
Absolutely. Last year, I created a how to start a vegetable garden ebook and guide. So it's actually a workbook. So if you've never grown a garden before, this will be a perfect resource for you to utilize to really help get what you're thinking you want down on paper and take you step by step through the process of, where do I even begin? Because there is a bit more to it than just maybe putting in a raised bed or just tilling up a little patch of your backyard or something like this. So it really walks you through step by step how to get started. And it's my pleasure to offer that to you guys for free so that you can get started. And I have contact information in there as well. So if you have questions along the way, I'm always happy to get emails from readers to help them out with their gardening woes.
So thank you, Courtney. And as I mentioned, we'll make sure that all the links are in the show notes for folks so they can just click on them and find you, and also grab that free gift. And thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your wealth of knowledge related to fall gardens.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening today. Don't forget to sign up for the waitlist so you'll be the first to know when our next free HobbySchool online learning summit launches. The link is in the show notes for this episode, or you can go to hobbyschool.com, and that's HobbySchool with school without an H in it. Talk soon.